In the late 1930s, the shadow of the First World War still hung heavy over the United States. The public was deeply disillusioned by the conflict, viewing it as a European entanglement that had cost American lives and treasure for no discernible gain. This never-again sentiment was a powerful political force, with many believing America's true destiny lay in focusing on its own hemisphere, protected by the vast buffer of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This isolationism was amplified by the domestic crisis of the Great Depression. With millions unemployed and the economy in ruins, the idea of spending fortunes on foreign armies or distant conflicts seemed absurd. Powerful groups like the America First Committee argued passionately that American resources should be used to rebuild America, not to defend old empires. The overwhelming consensus was clear. The unfolding conflicts in Europe and Asia were not America's fight. In this version of history, the isolationist movement succeeds completely. While President Roosevelt might still have harbored sympathies for the Allies, Congress, reflecting the will of the people, refuses to be drawn in. Key legislative battles are lost by the interventionists. The Destroyers for Bases deal is rejected as a clear violation of neutrality. The critical Lend-Lease Act is defeated in a narrow but decisive vote. America truly seals itself off. Strict neutrality acts are enforced, prohibiting American ships from entering war zones and forbidding loans or credits to any belligerent nation. The U.S. commits to a policy of Fortress America, focusing entirely on continental defense, building up its own military not for intervention, but for the sole purpose of repelling any direct attack on the homeland. The world would now have to face the Axis powers alone. For the United Kingdom, the American decision is a catastrophic blow. The Battle of Britain is fought with a terrible desperation, the RAF's pilots knowing that no replacements for their battered Spitfires and Hurricanes will be coming from across the Atlantic. Without American high-octane aviation fuel, the performance of their aircraft suffers, and without the promise of future aid, public morale begins to crack under the strain of the relentless blitz. The Battle of the Atlantic becomes an unwinnable nightmare. Lacking American naval escorts and anti-submarine technology, German U-boat wolf packs decimate the vital convoys. Food supplies dwindle, factories slow to a halt as raw materials run out, and the island nation is slowly strangled. Britain stands completely, terrifyingly alone. With its back to the wall and no lifeline in sight, the breaking point arrives in late 1941 or 1942, after a series of devastating military defeats, perhaps a failed harvest, and the complete severing of its supply lines. A political crisis grips London. The Churchill government, symbolizing defiance, collapses. A new government is formed on the single promise of ending the suffering and seeking terms with Germany. The fight simply cannot be sustained. Hitler, now the undisputed master of Europe, dictates a harsh peace. It is not an occupation, but a humiliation. The treaty forces the United Kingdom to demilitarize, effectively scuttle the Royal Navy, and cede control of key strategic territories like Gibraltar, Malta, and the Suez Canal. Britain becomes an economic vassal of the new German order. Its empire dismantled, its power broken. With the Western Front secured and Britain neutralized, Hitler is free to turn his undivided attention eastward. The threat of a future American-led invasion of France is gone. This allows the Wehrmacht to transfer hundreds of thousands of veteran troops, elite panzer divisions, and entire Luftwaffe fleets from occupation duty in the West directly to the staging grounds. For Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, when it comes, is on a scale far greater than in our history. There is no distraction, no need to garrison a rest of France or fight a war in North Africa. All of us strengthen Germany's resources, its steel, its oil, its manpower are focused on a single objective, the total and complete destruction of the Soviet state. The Soviet Union's struggle becomes a nightmare of attrition. The absence of American Lend-Lease is a crippling blow. It is not the lack of tanks or planes that hurts most, but the lack of logistics. Without the hundreds of thousands of American-made trucks, the Red Army cannot maneuver. Without American locomotives and steel rails, the vital rail network for supplying the front and evacuating factories collapses. The German advance is faster and more brutal. Moscow falls. The industrial heartland of the Donbas is secured. The siege of Leningrad ends in the city's capture. The Soviets are pushed back past the Ural Mountains, fighting a desperate, losing battle in the Siberian wastes, while resistance may never fully cease. The Soviet Union as a coherent military and industrial power is effectively broken. In the Pacific, the calculus for Japan changes entirely. Without the threat of American intervention, there is no strategic need to attack Pearl Harbor. The United States, committed to its own neutrality, might not have even enacted the full oil embargo that pushed Japan to war. Japan is free to pursue its southern operation without fear of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The Japanese military sweeps through Southeast Asia with impunity. Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines fall like dominoes. Australia is completely isolated, cut off from its allies and facing the imminent threat of invasion. Japan becomes the undisputed master of a vast Pacific empire, rich in oil, rubber, and other resources, with no naval power left in the world capable of challenging it. For China, which had already been fighting a brutal war against Japan since 1937, American neutrality means the end of all hope. The tenuous supply line over the hump from India never materializes. The famed flying tigers never arrive to contest the skies. China is left completely alone, facing the full might of the Imperial Japanese Army. With its resource needs in the Pacific secured and no American threat, Japan redeploys its most battle-hardened divisions from Manchuria for a final, decisive offensive against the nationalist Chinese. Chiang Kai-shek's government, trapped deep in the interior, is unable to resist. China is forced to surrender, ending its long, agonizing struggle and ceding control of its coastal regions and industrial centers to Japanese rule. Back in the United States, the mood is not one of peace, but of profound fear. The nation now stands as the last major democracy in a world dominated by two victorious, hostile empires, a German-controlled Europe and Africa, and a Japanese-controlled Asia-Pacific. The fortress, America doctrine becomes a permanent reality, a nation under self-imposed siege. Massive, unprecedented defense spending becomes the norm. The U.S. builds a gigantic two-ocean navy, lines its coasts with formidable artillery batteries and airfields, and maintains a standing army of millions. Society becomes heavily militarized, not for conquest, but for sheer survival, as Americans watch and wait, nervously eyeing the two fascist superpowers that rule the rest of the planet. The economic consequences of this neutrality are severe. In our timeline, WWII ended the Great Depression and triggered an unprecedented industrial boom. In this history, with no allies to supply and no global trade routes open, the American economy stagnates. Fortress Europe and the co-prosperity sphere are closed, hostile trading blocs. The U.S. is forced into a policy of near total self-sufficiency, or autarky. The economy is permanently geared toward defense spending, which drains national wealth rather than creating it. Unemployment remains a persistent problem, and the standard of living stagnates. The post-war prosperity that defined 20th century America never happens. The race for the atomic bomb still happens, but it is far more terrifying. The Manhattan Project proceeds, driven not by a need to defeat the Axis, but by the mortal terror that a victorious Nazi Germany, now in control of Europe's greatest scientists and resources, will get it first. The project is an act of pure desperation, a belief that the only deterrent to an attack is a weapon of equal or greater power. This creates a terrifying new global dynamic. When the U.S. successfully tests its weapon, it is not used to end a war, but to begin a new, terrifying standoff. Germany and Japan, with their own vast resources, would be frantically pursuing their own nuclear programs. The world would not have a brief American monopoly, but a three-way race toward mutual annihilation. The post-war world descends into a new kind of Cold War, but one far more precarious than our own. It is not a bipolar conflict between two superpowers, but a multipolar standoff between three. The German Reich, master of Europe and Africa, the Empire of Japan, master of the Pacific, and the isolated United States, master of the Americas. These three blocs would eye each other with permanent hostility. The two fascist empires, once allies of convenience, would likely become bitter rivals themselves. The U.S. would be the isolated democratic holdout. Proxy wars would be fought over the few remaining unaligned territories, such as South America, with the constant, looming threat of nuclear exchange. In this hostile world, American society would inevitably change, and not for the better. To maintain a permanent, militarized, high-alert status against two globe-spanning fascist powers, the federal government would assume unprecedented control over daily life. Conscription would be permanent. Censorship of news from abroad and defeatist or subversive domestic speech would become commonplace. The intense, pervasive fear of infiltration by German and Japanese spies would lead to a paranoid, insular culture. Civil liberties, which were championed as the reason for staying out of the war, would be severely curtailed in the name of national security. The United States might survive geographically, but its soul, its very commitment to liberty, would be under constant siege from within. In this alternate 20th century, the great isms of fascism and imperialism would not be defeated ideas, but proven, successful models of government. The Holocaust would be completed, its horrors unknown or denied by the victors. The brutal racial hierarchies of the Nazis and the Japanese would be cemented as the governing principles for billions of people. The concepts of universal human rights, decolonization, and international law, all born from the Allied victory in our timeline, would simply not exist. The United Nations would never be formed. It would be a world ruled by the fist, where science, art, and culture are bent to serve the will of the state, and the light of human freedom would be extinguished across most of the globe. This alternate history serves as a chilling reminder of the fragility of the world we know. By choosing neutrality, the United States would have saved its own blood and treasure in the short term, only to inherit a world so dark and hostile that its own survival would be in permanent doubt. The 20th century would be remembered not as the American century, but as the dawn of a long, dark age. The decision to intervene, so costly and so debated, was not just about defeating the enemies, but about the very shape of the future. The world we live in, with all its flaws, was built on the foundation of that victory. Had America stayed home, that foundation would have been built on values we find abhorrent, and the world today would be a place we would not recognize.